Before we get into the heart of the conversation, I wanted to, of course, welcome Edwin Paalvast as our guest. Very pleased to see you again and have you here. Before we start, just a few comments. We will stick to 30 minutes, so at the top of the hour we will be finished. The session is being recorded. If anyone is uncomfortable with that, please, I suggest that you do not speak or share your name, but in any case, no participant names are visible on the recording. Otherwise, I hope that you will have a very nice Depsys Cafe for the next 30 minutes. There is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen as part of the Zoom, and please just use that to ask questions along the way, and we'll make sure that we cover them. We don't have to wait until the end, because I think perhaps we may be able to talk for much longer. So to make sure that you have time to ask your questions, please just put your questions at any time in the Q&A. So with that being said, in terms of the engagement, I want to thank Edwin Paalvast for being here. Talking about what does digitalization really mean for utilities and what can we learn from other industries. You have, of course, a impressive career over the past decades, starting out with a very scientific background as a research and consultant, but then spending many years, 2 decades, I believe, at Cisco in one of the key roles running Cisco for Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Russia region. And then now you are running the international markets part of Philips. And in your career have, of course, had the opportunity to see and work directly with many industries, many industry sectors that have digitalized over time. And the reason we're talking about this with utilities, before I ask you for a bit more detailed introduction, the reason we're talking about this for utilities is that the utilities traditionally have been slow in digitalizing because it hasn't been necessary. And there's always been a view that there is a risk of compromising the supply, the reliable supply of energy, which is ultimately the main mission of utilities. Today, of course, this changes because we are looking at a world in which we need to decarbonize, which means accelerated electrification using clean energy, which means adoption of renewable energies, which are by definition intermittent, which are unreliable, unpredictable. Well, not, I should say unpredictable rather than unreliable, but it means a whole bidirectional flow environment that makes it very challenging because the old ways in which we manage the electricity grid no longer apply. And so utilities today are all at a certain stage in their adoption of technology as a way to digitalize and are asking themselves quite a lot of questions about how should we be doing this. I think your experience from your current job and previous jobs is hugely relevant. So if you wouldn't mind, could you perhaps spend a few minutes just introducing yourself with more background and your overall perspective about digitalization?
Yeah, so thank you very much, Anja, and thanks for having me. And good afternoon to everybody on the call. Perhaps based on the background, Philips, of course, a very known brand name, but Philips has changed significantly over the past years. Where it's known for, like light or some of the appliances, like air fryers, those have all been sold to other parties, and also televisions. So what's today's Philips is actually 80% health systems. So this is actually what you all know about MRs and CTs, etc. So the imaging part, but also part of the what we call image-guided therapy or cath labs, where you can do interventions in heart or neuro, actually without big operations. But also a lot of IT to monitor patients and these times of COVID, ventilation, etc. But also out of hospital care. So it's evolving very, very rapidly. And Philips is actually heavily invested in digitization as an answer to what Philips believes is going to be the future of healthcare. But you already mentioned the background in Cisco, where I've been for 21 years, and also being quite active in the utility space and also health systems, and understanding what the impact would be of digitization, which of course starts with communication of data and connectivity and the networking that's behind it. So in that sense, also had some good experience there. But just want to make sure the context, and I run actually sales, marketing services for anything but the US and China. So that's what international markets comprises of. To your question, so what I've seen in different industries is there's always some kind of an external factor that drives that need for digitization. I've been working for a long time in telecoms. Clearly, a strong competitive drive has led to very strong digitization, where a lot of things were actually built in hardware. And of course, telecom being also utility, serviceability, reliability has always been really, really important. What was added to the fact is that we as consumers consume more and more data, more and more Netflix, more and more video conferencing, and the price actually remained stable, despite the whole traffic growing 30-40% every year consistently, whatever happened. So that's been a challenge that was countered by taking a digitization, sometimes centralizing a lot of things to get scale. And also companies became global companies to be able to share insights, technology, etc., and buying power. So that was a very interesting industry. If I looked at utilities, a lot of work was done over the past years in trying to understand what the technology would be behind this. And clearly you're dealing with physics, you're dealing with a bit of the need to actually be able to react very quickly to changes in demand. Particularly when now it's going from more of a distributive network concept to also local production.
Yeah, exactly.
And that local production of either solar panels or wind power or other forms of sustainable energy. And also changing patterns as people don't typically work only in the office anymore. We've seen this also with the pandemic. The energy usage is also changing patterns, and it's far less predictable. So there's all the different elements that we saw in the telecom space as well. Now, before I go on the utilities, let me go into look at health systems. What's happening there? Clearly, COVID has been a watershed, and that's where it's become clear that where the first attempt was to get everybody to the hospital to be able to treat people, and when you have a pandemic, that's probably not a good idea. And secondly, where maintaining the equipment and also servicing equipment and making understanding what consumables, which you typically see in different pieces of equipment or the helium that's used to cool these machines. We needed actually more capabilities to do this remotely, right? So there's been a massive push now because we couldn't move people around. We couldn't fly people, maintenance engineers around the world. We had to do much more local.
Yeah.
And that also really prompted a very different way of looking at this industry, but also looking at the fact that you need to think about how do you treat people remotely, how do you treat them at home. And that also drove a very big digitization wave.
To be able to do this, whether it be tend to your machines remotely or treat patients remotely, I guess it means having access to different kind of information.
Yeah.
So it means having access to data that perhaps was not used or not accessible before. Huh? So how is that evolving in the healthcare sector? If we look at the whole IoT development, for example, across industries, how are you experiencing that?
Yeah. So clearly, if you look at the utility industry, data is very, very sensitive. First of all, you need to secure it so that nobody else can get access to it. But also even what people consume in terms of electricity is privacy sensitive. Now you can imagine if you go to the health systems world, that's even more so, right? Because you're dealing with patient data, you're dealing with very sensitive data, and you need to make sure you protect it very well. So it is difficult to extract data because of the different regulations, laws, but also the concern that hospitals, doctors have in terms of where the data is going. So we had to look at many things in a way that was, of course, compliant with local laws, but also in a way that the patient could keep control over that data or determine what would happen with that data. And if you then look at the data we're kind of collecting, part of this is, of course, usage information of machines, etc., and information needed for maintenance. Now that's if you anonymize that, that's less sensitive. But very quickly you get to data that's more sensitive. And for example, we bought a company that actually connects a lot of platforms. Could connect your smartwatch, could connect your phone, could connect all kinds of sensors you wear. And we bought a company that actually monitors your heart rate and saturation, etc., which is really important with some people that are suffering from long COVID, and then be able to track you at home or even treat you at home with oxygen, etc. So there's been all these different things. So we needed that instrumentation, the telemetry, which of course is also really important in utility networks to understand the performance, the load, potential problems. And then the whole question was, where do we analyze? And in many cases in health systems, all the analytics will have to be done locally because of privacy concerns, or people will just not allow any data to leave the hospital for all the good reasons. But then you also need to be able to collect all that data anonymously and be able to learn from it and then actually share those learnings again. So there's this continuous tension between localizing the analytics, but then also globalizing it. If I go back to the world of telecoms, that's why we saw that it was able to globalize, because it was able to, a lot of the data be anonymized. And there were massive benefits that actually came from that.
And you can accelerated way to offer better user service, user experience. If you can build your conclusions based on anonymized data. So you're triggering several questions in my mind. One is this point about, as you say, some of it needs to be treated locally in terms of data because of data privacy, and I guess perhaps also latency sometimes may play a role. Yeah. What about, because if I do a parallel with utilities, there's a big discussion about where do you put the intelligence and how much of it to what extent do you centralize everything, all the different data points that you can gather about the performance of your grid, about the weather environment, about other factors, how much do you bring all this centralized, and you have a big data lake that you manage there, and you basically see what it tells you, versus you look to process some activities and some conclusions at the edge, because perhaps that is a way to either reduce cost or improve latency or other. Also with your of course networking, data networking experience at Cisco, what's your view on that, and what are the, I know there's no one obvious yes or no answer, but what are the considerations perhaps you think utilities should be having about how to approach that when they decide on their architectures?
Yeah, so first of all, there's the laws of physics, because if you need data to make decisions about how you distribute load or how you respond to changes in either production or demand, you clearly need to be able to respond very quickly. And then it's going to be the physics that actually limit your architecture, because if you centralize too much, you'll introduce much more latency because of the need to communicate across large distances. And that might just make it infeasible to respond to the changes once you've done the data analytics. So I think a lot of this is around an analysis of what kind of data you want to ingest, what data you need to make the right decisions, and some of them will be local. Because you have to make local switching decisions on distribution center in an area or in a part of the city, and some decisions will have to be propagated, of course, at the country level perhaps, or even beyond, based on if the instabilities or the changes are so profound that it actually takes response from other parts of the grid. So I think it's going to be a hybrid solution that you need to do this, and there might be multiple levels of decision making that you want to support with that data based on the size of the changes that are happening.
Yeah, okay, and that which is very interesting and makes a lot of sense, and at the same time it means the utilities actually need to know what kind of decisions they need to be able to make. So what are the business decisions that this data is supposed to underpin, which then becomes really point number one, and to understand based on that, where does it make most sense to process the data? Yeah. Edwin, another question that was triggered by, and sorry, let me just, before I ask that, to say for the participants, please do ask questions if you have any, just write them in the Q&A. Another question, based on what you were just saying about, receiving the data from within Philips, having access to this and then analyzing it. I'm curious to understand how you're approaching that from a skills perspective, because it does require different kind of profile of capabilities in-house, and to what extent are you relying perhaps on external parties? Are your vendors doing any of it, or how does or your suppliers, how does that actually work in practice? What's the model you think to follow?
Now, so if you look at the last 10 years, there was a lot of hardware engineers that built the big imaging equipment, whether it were CTs or MRs, etc. But recently, more than half of our R&D is actually moved to software and things like machine learning and artificial intelligence. So it's been a major shift, and this we've acquired that talent through hiring and a lot of collaborations with universities and hospitals and joint research, but also through acquisitions. We just did, for example, we look at Europe. We did 2 acquisitions in France. Where we acquired over 200 data scientists. So of course they also had a product which was really important, but also the fact that they had the skill sets was very important to us to make the decision. And we keep on investing in those resources. And let's be very clear, it's a very much in demand skill set. And so as an employer, you need to make sure you're very attractive, that you have kind of work for them that they can learn from, an interesting environment, an environment with purpose, to make sure that those kind of people come and join you. But it is by far the biggest thrust we have right now in terms of doing this. And that's on 2 levels. We build in the cloud and health platform, which allows us to connect all kinds of types of data, do analytics on it, etc. But also we have solutions that, of course, work in the field. And nearly every piece of medical equipment nowadays has built-in forms of machine learning and AI to analyze, accelerate, etc.
Yeah, and that is where, with the parallel with the utilities, there's still a way to go, because a lot of the equipment that makes up the electricity grid does not have that embedded intelligence. So one is being able to capture data, but the other one is, as you say, is to actually be able to process it, right? And building that out is what is needed, of course, to have what we call a smart grid, which will then allow to make, as you say, very precise real-time decisions about flows and about balancing and about loading and so forth.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and those are going to be the things that we need. But I think the interesting question is, as this is still in its infancy, is to start thinking around what are the kind of data you want to ingest, and also particularly as you start rolling out smart meters, etc. What's the kind of data you need? What would be the new evolution of all kind of home networks? What could be the ones to interface with, so that not just the metering by itself is smart, but also, for example, I could switch on my washing machine, but it would only be truly switched on by the network even when there's capacity, or when I charge my car to do the same. Right, so those would be, in my view, the main questions, which also happened in both the telecom and healthcare areas. When we started to think about new ways of operating, new ways of working, you need to have your data architecture. So what kind of data do you collect? When do you collect it? How do you collect it? And where are you going to store it? And then where are you going to run those algorithms that actually give you those insights? Those are the fundamental questions to ask for. And then again, utilities do have the challenge of the real-time element, right? Which also constrains what you can do and when. With
much like healthcare, not a lot of allowance for errors, right? I mean, you have to continue to provide stable provisioning of electricity at all times. Edwin, where do you start as an organization? And because you can start with the technology so that you can capture the data, and then you see, or you can start with your people and the skills, or you can start with your processes, or you can start perhaps with, the defining the strategy and the end goal and kind of describing what good would look like. And where should a business start?
Yeah, so I think you already summarized it well, Anja. It's starting at a point, I think, of a vision where you believe the end state will migrate to. It's clear now with sustainability, and Philips is been very, very active there, also in a very early stage, because we very early on believed that's what's going to be, first of all, what's the right thing to do, but also from a business model that you need to build that on sustainability. And we've been driving a lot of initiatives. We've been, whether it was from energy usage or the way you produce, We're now also committed, where we started also in our Cisco times with, on the circular economy and how do you drive this. So those are all things that I think are going to be part of a world that consumers, governments, the society in general is going to expect from you. So that's, I think, an underlying drive that you need to have as anybody kind of operating in society right now. But then secondly, what happened in Glasgow, and some people might say it's not enough. Some people say, well, it's going to be very challenging to do the transition. But regardless, you're going to see that drive towards a sustainable future. And that would mean more fragmentation of production. That would mean more local production. That would mean also more local consumption and far less predictable consumption. So if you look at all these different elements, then you realize, okay, I need to build that understanding of what I need to measure, what decisions I will have to make. And of course, there's a lot of players in the industry doing a lot of work on it. But be ahead of that curve and kind of brainstorm on what it could look like. And I've been very impressed as I joined Philips that the team that's been working this already many years ago started to kind of project what could happen. Now, of course, things have played out differently, but the fundamental data, telemetry, capability you needed, they actually got it pretty right? So I think that's an example of how to drive this. And of course, these are incremental steps. It's not that you go from one step to something else, but it's a lot of trials, it's a lot of collaboration, learnings from other industries, but also other players in the industry, because in some places in the world, they've really taken this quite far already. And of course, there's many vendors also in the world that have also come up with ideas and kind of missions on what they want to achieve, right? And if you do this all, but the key point I think is what I've always called, I said it also when I was at Cisco, your data is the new oil, right? So or the new energy, so that's what's going to determine whether you can actually meet those future challenges, whether you can inform your customers about what's happening, you can help to change their behavior or automate changes in behavior, like switching on electrical equipment or heating based on capacity. Those are all the things that we would need in the future to actually drive that new sustainable world.
So given that you don't know the use cases for the future necessarily, you need to build a solution, a system that is sufficiently flexible and intelligent to allow you to be able to adapt to whatever the needs of the future will be on this. I see one question here, so let me just read this. So thank you for some great insights. How should companies approach adopting data internally within their daily operations to gain most value? This is more about actually driving adoption, I guess, ultimately, because, leaders can have a great vision, but how do you get people on a daily basis to actually change their behaviors?
Yeah, so what I've learned from my career, if you give people the right data and insights, I've always seen people adapt, right? But the challenge sometimes is, and I always need to think about Charlie Chaplin, where in the Industrial Revolution, he was somewhere just turning the knobs, right?
Exactly.
And he was doing that all day. He had no clue what he was doing it for, where it was going. And I think a lot of the challenges is that many people are like that, right? You're part of a bigger system, and you're doing certain things, and you're not entirely sure what you can change to make that change. So to give that insight to people themselves, so to show them what they're doing today, what the whole company wants to do in the future, what are the data points that they can learn from to change their behavior, right? So use data to explain things to people, to show them, to also get their buy-in, because the moment people see the impact of their change in behavior, most that excites people. They want to be part of something bigger. They want to drive something. So that to me would be the key points to map that out. And for example, if I see what I did in different roles I had, I was always working on making sure that anybody kind of, even on your smartphone, could get kind of an overview. So, but we spoke about certain initiatives, certain changes, but how we're doing. And sometimes even do what we call sprints to drive a change by focusing on something for 3 to 5 months, and then make a significant progress on it, and then turn it into a marathon, right? So you can keep on sustaining that, and then you can focus on something else. And that's the way to transform, because particularly in the more complex systems, such as utilities, it's not as if you're a creative person that creates a new ad or something, and you can do this in a splendid isolation. Utilities, by definition, are very connected systems. So you have to have people move in unison if you want to drive the change. So this ability to take the data and socialize it essentially, and have everybody sharing it or everybody have a view on it, so that they can see their impact is in my view really important.
Yeah, that's a really, really good advice actually, and because I think it's most people, yeah, they don't on a daily basis, they don't see because the metrics aren't called out. So that's a really good piece of advice. I'm conscious of time. We are just warming up, but we're actually getting to the end in a few minutes. Question for you, a last one, which is there's the extra challenge of the utilities. So especially so in some countries the utilities have been liberalized, in some countries they have not. Yeah. Even in liberalized countries where it's liberalized, there's still a factor of regulated part of the business, which is, you know, de facto monopoly in its own geographies, because we're not going to put in, it's a bit like telecoms back at the time, right? We're not going to put in more copper if we don't have to, but of course telecoms went fully liberalized and you can have different providers running over. But how do you, with the ownership of the assets, and which is where the big investments are, and the difficulty about managing the assets, how do you drive this kind of what you're describing about, you know, motivation to digitalize and the vision, if you're operating in a space that fundamentally isn't subject to the normal, let's say, enterprise type competitive environment, you know, challenges or push? How do you drive a sense of urgency and get people along with you?
Yeah, so I have to say that what I saw in for example, Philips, or the CEO Frans van Houten, very early on actually started to deploy this vision around a sustainable future, around the fact that you needed data, etc. And he was able to rally people behind it. And of course, it wasn't a regulated industry as such, but there was also no need at that point in time to actually drive those things and to be ahead of the curve, because you know, you could have stayed in the back basically and move with the industry. So I think the utility being, they derive their monopoly from the fact that they supply utility to the broader audience. But you're part of that industry, you're part of that society. And so I think there's also a need, as I worked with utility, I've seen many in the management layers being very aware of the fact that they need to play that role. And part of that role is that you actually think about where society is heading, and then if that's to a sustainable future, what that would mean, right? And I have no doubt in many, there's already long discussions happening. But what I would say is, particularly if you talk about data, because also those investments you need to do in those capabilities are completely dwarfed by the investments you need to do to build and maintain a grid. So in that sense, it's difficult to change in utilities. On the other hand, the investments needed to actually drive more to an insight-driven decision-making and data-driven decision-making are relatively small compared to the bigger picture. And so they could be kind of done whilst you also do all the other investments. And if you start early enough, then you actually will end up at least with the basics that will help you to make those decisions. If you don't know exactly, as you said, what the use cases are or what the specific cases are you need to make decisions on, you just know that you need that data to drive that.
Yep, that is, thank you. I think we need to finish there. Edwin, thank you very much. And your point about understanding to, well, yes, I guess how you can anticipate what the future is likely to be like, so that you don't act with your back up against the wall, but you actually have some space to maneuver in the direction you want to maneuver in is really key. So thank you very much. It's the top of the hour. I promised we would stop within half an hour. So thank you very much for taking the time. And thank you for the participants. We look forward to sharing the insights from this more broadly afterwards. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Anja.